Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line in the northern direction in Satovo and Kreminna section of the front line, in the Chasiv Yar direction, but mostly in the Kurakhove direction where the Russians have actually stormed the city itself. So starting out here in the south, we see that the Russians have managed to gain full control of Yasna Polyana, as we see with this geolocated footage confirming this Russian advance. The Russians flanking the Ukrainian positions managed to gain a foothold in the forest line south of Yasna Polyana. The Ukrainians had yet to set up a proper strong defense in the settlement, and there's no fortified positions surrounding it, so the Russians captured it fairly quickly. The fighting is still taking place over Shakhtarska, so the Russians are looking to gain full control of it. In the direction of Novoukrainka, the Russians got full control over this settlement, where fighting continues over the fortified positions north of it. At the same time, the Russians gained 100% full control over Yavlinka and the farm area in the northeast. They also pushed into the southern outskirts of Trudove. Trudove is a settlement that has two parts. There's the southern part, and then there's the northern part across the river line. And the southern part has been captured by the Russians, leaving the northern parts remaining under Ukrainian control with the river line in between. The Russians will here look to connect the two tips of the eastern and western parts to cut off any Ukrainian presence here in the pocket that is forming. This is why the Russians are attacking directly between Boyavlenka and Novoukrainka to connect the two sides. The objective here is to pin down the Ukrainian forces trapped within the gap between Novoukrainka and Boyavlenka, and at the same time to advance north of Novoukrainka towards Maximivka, taking advantage of the capture of Yasna Polyana to push from the western side as well. And then a combined push from the east as well will significantly increase the size of the pocket, cut off several fortified positions of the Ukrainians, and move on to capture the next settlement of Maximivka. We see that previously I analyzed the situation saying that the Russians will look to gain control over Yavlinka, Novoukrainka, then move on to Shakhtarsk, Yasna Polyana, and Maximivka. It seems that the Russians combined both into a single assault, and now the next target will be to completely gain control over these settlements. Shakhtarsk and Maximivka are the next targets of the Russians. Gaining control over those will create a large enough buffer around Volodar to then push in the direction of Konstantinopol and Antonivka here in the west of Kurakhove. It will also give the Russians an opportunity to push in the direction of Velika Novosilka. This will take place where the Russians will look to gain control of the fortified positions north of the settlement by pushing in the direction of Rostolne, and then from cutting off the roads east, north, and southeast of the settlement, the Ukrainians would have only one paved road remaining to supply Velika Novosilka, which the Russians could move towards Novodarivka, Rifnopil to gain fire control over that remaining road, leaving only open field roads, dirt roads in and out of the settlement, giving it a very difficult position to resupply all of the areas that it should. And this will begin the siege of Velika Novosilka from the northeast, southeast, and west of the settlement. So there's multiple options opening up for the Russians. Velika Novosilka is the last regional hub in southwestern Donetsk. Capturing that would leave nothing of significance in between the area in the whole southwestern parts all the way to Kurakhove in the north, which the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Katerynivka as they move on to Yelisavetivka in the south. There's no foothold in Antonivka yet, considering that the Russians still have to gain control of the fortified positions in the north, where the 33rd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainians using Leopard tanks are operating to prevent a Russian breakthrough. The Russians have a very difficult time moving into Antonivka in the north due to the presence of elite Ukrainian units, but in the southern parts the defense is not as significant, as the Russians have managed to disorganize the resistance by pushing in such a wide area with a lot of units to gain control over the situation and define it in their favor. So what we're seeing is that the Russians are advancing on all four settlements at the same time, and now they're moving on to close the pockets that have been created gain full control of the settlements they're fighting over and move on to Maximivka and Trudovo in the south, all the way towards opening the front for a potential encirclement of Kurakhove. This all takes place as the Russians stormed Kurakhove directly from the east, gaining full control of the dacha area between Maximilianivka and Kurakhove. And we see with this geolocated footage here that the Russians were indeed located within the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove, entering the settlement itself. The Russian forces storming Kurakhove from the east met with heavy resistance. This means that the forces that actually were able to enter Kurakhove is only a fraction of the ones that started the assault, and how much they'll be able to actually hold on to, will they be able to gain a foothold and so on, that is a different question. So we'll have to see the next couple of days whether the Russians will expand their foothold, hold their foothold, or even be kicked out again, as the Ukrainians have a significant force in Kurakhove to withstand a Russian assault. At the same time, the Russians are reporting that they are storming towards Rusliv here in the north, where they are launching FAB bombs and heavy artillery on the settlement before storming it directly. This would be a very long breakthrough following the capture of Yasna Polyana, and it would allow the Russians to hit the supply lines going in and out of Kurakhove from the west. So we may see some significant developments here in the Kurakhove section over the next few days. Moving to the north of Kurakhove, the Russians are storming Kurakhivka both directly from Hirnik in the north, but also the mine area which they have managed to gain control of. This secured the western flank of Kurakhivka, and with this the Russians will continue down Kurakhivka to the outskirts of it to gain full control of it as they move through towards Vovchenka and so on. The Ukrainian supply lines are very limited. They have to go through this singular road here by Vovchenka, which a lot of soldiers would have to withdraw through if they decide on withdrawal. Otherwise, they would have to hold their positions, which would require a lot of supplies. And considering the only road is within close proximity to Ostrivske, which is Russian held, the Ukrainians would have a very difficult time resupplying any of their forces within Kurakhivka or withdrawing from it. So we see heavy fighting takes place in Kurakhivka, and it will likely reach Vovchenka soon, as the Russians continue their operations north of Kurakhove. Moving further in the direction of Chasiv Yar, geolocated footage shows the Russians have advanced along the main highway between the canal and Stupushki, as the Russians continue offensive operations here in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. We see heavy fighting takes place within the settlement itself, but the Ukrainian resistance is strong, so the Russians are looking to expand the front line and try out new flanks, which has led to several advances by the Russians both on the southern and northern flanks, but mostly here in the south. Moving further north, the Russians have advanced within Terny, gaining full control of the northern parts of the settlement, moving into the central parts. Now that the Russians have gained control over the part of Terny that connects with the road going to the east, the Russians could look to launch an operation to close this pocket and gain an additional supply route in and out of Terny. Then it will move further south and do the same further south. So we see that the Russians, as they gain more and more control over Terny, the fighting over the settlement becomes easier and easier before they then move on to Yampolivka and then down south towards Torske, where the Russians still have the foothold in the northern outskirts of the settlement. We see heavy fighting takes place along the Sirbets river line as well. In the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians have advanced in the direction of Kurakhivka, gaining control of the western outskirts of the settlement along the Osk river line, and fighting continues in the direction of Serisove. So we see all throughout the front line, the Russians are heavily fighting, especially in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. It is becoming clear that the Russians are looking to gain full control over the Kurakhove direction. Pretty much everything south of Selidove within the Donetsk region, where their objective is to gain control over the main hubs of Velika Novosilka and Kurakhove, but also to gain control over pretty much everything within it. And this is being done through the offensive operations to first gain control over Kurakhove, which is the center of the Ukrainian supplies and presence within the southern parts of the Donetsk region, where Velika Novosilka is more and better connected to Zaporizhia than the Donetsk region itself. Cutting off the area west of Kurakhove will also cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka, which is the main supply line in and out of the settlement, which would then allow for a rear attack on Velika Novosilka. So again, the main focus is Kurakhove. That is the #1 priority of the Russians, after which you'll move on to Velika Novosilka and Pokrovsk itself. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.